Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss the topic History of Endocrinology. The main objectives of today's lecture are to get a brief idea about the history of endocrinology, to understand the events that lead to the discoveries of hormones, to know about the discovery of various endocrine glands, and finally we will describe the functional understanding of hormones and their disorders. To begin with, let us first discuss the history of endocrinology. The field of physiology and medicine that deals with the study of endocrine glands and hormones is known as endocrinology. The discovery of the endocrine system has a long history that involves a wide variety of unusual experiments, conflicting opinions, as well as mutual agreements. The history of endocrinology dates back to the Dark Ages, when victors of battles ate their enemies' organs, thinking they contained important powers, an old-fashioned version of hormone replacement. Perhaps one of the most notable historical displays of endocrinology was the practice of castration, which gained popularity in the 17th century to prevent puberty and preserve the singing voices of young male singers. These men were then known as the castrati. A deeper understanding of the endocrinology was gained in the late 19th century with contributions by the eminent scientists as described in the table. Some of the significant and notable contributions were made by Friedrich Henle, Claude Bernard, Arnold Berthold, Charles Brown, Victor Horsley, Earl Sutherland, and Otto Loewi. Friedrich Henle in 1841 was the first to recognize ductless glands, glands that secrete their products directly into the bloodstream and not into specialized ducts. It was in 1849 that Claude Bernard postulated that the internal environment of the cells in the body is constantly regulated. In 1855, he also proposed that substances can be synthesized and secreted internally within the body by demonstrating the production and release of glucose from the liver, as is shown in the figure. In this way, perhaps he can be considered to be the father of endocrinology, even though we nowadays won't consider glucose to be a hormone. In 1849, Arnold Berthold noted that castrated cockerels did not develop combs and wattles or exhibit overtly male behavior. He found that replacement of testes back into the abdominal cavity of the same bird or another castrated bird resulted in normal behavioral and morphological development, and he erroneously concluded that the testes secreted a substance that conditioned the blood that in turn acted on the body of the cockerel. In fact, one of the two other things could have been true, that the testes modified or activated a constituent of blood, or that the testes removed an inhibitory factor from the blood. It was not proven that the testes released a substance that engenders male characteristics until it was shown that the extract of testes could replace their function in castrated animals. Pure crystalline testosterone was isolated in 1935. Also, Charles Brown Squared injected himself with the extracts of animal testicles and reported significant improvement in his strength, stamina, and concentration. He was probably the first person who came with an idea of endocrine replacement therapy. The notion of the replacement therapy was next nurtured by a famous surgeon, Victor Horsley, who initially noticed that dissecting the thyroid gland from monkeys led to the development of myxedema symptoms. Later, he proposed transplantation of sheep's thyroid into human patients to improve clinical outcomes. His idea was cultivated by another physician, George Murray, who made an extract of sheep's thyroid, that is pink thyroid juice, and injected it into a woman patient and found an astonishing improvement in her condition. Now that we have understood the historical perspective of endocrinology in general, we will now discuss the first defined hormone and its discovery. In 1902, William Bayliss and Ernest Starling performed an experiment in which they observed that acid instilled into the duodenum caused the pancreas to begin secretion, even after they had removed all nervous connections between the two. The same response could be produced by injecting extract of jejunum mucosa into the jugular vein, showing that some factor in the mucosa was responsible. They named this substance secretin and coined the term hormone for chemicals that act in this way. Now, dear students, let's have a look at discovery of the insulin hormone. In the period of 1900 to 1930, many hormones were identified and a wide range of research on hormone biochemistry, reproductive cycle, and endocrine related surgeries were performed. In 1916, the Association for the Study of Internal Secretions was established, which is presently known as the Endocrine Society. Joseph von Mering and Oskar Minkowski made the observation in 1889 that removing the pancreas surgically led to an increase in blood sugar, followed by a coma and eventual death. Symptoms of diabetes mellitus. The journey of insulin identification started in the 19th century with the observation that dissection of the pancreas from dogs resulted in the onset of diabetes. However, in that time, isolation of insulin was difficult as the pancreas makes both endocrine and exocrine secretions. In 1922, Frederick Banting and Charles Best discovered insulin when they reversed diabetes in dogs with pancreatic islet cell extract of healthy dogs. They later purified bovine insulin with the help of James Collip and John MacLeod and used it to treat humans with diabetes. This revolutionized the treatment of diabetes worldwide. Since then, the field of endocrinology and especially diabetes has continued to grow with the creation of new diabetes medications. The invention of the insulin pump and advances in pancreas and islet cell transplantation. Dear students, now moving on to the next, let us discuss the discovery of sex hormones. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Eugen Steinack discovered sex hormones through his experiments on rats. He simply removed testicles from rats and implanted them in rats' abdomen, and he found that normal male characteristics of the rats were terminated. Later, he revealed that interstitial cells of the testes produce male sex hormones. Dear students, now coming to the discovery of neurohormones. Neurohormones were first identified by Otto Loewy in 1921. He incubated a frog's heart innervated with its vagus nerve attached in a saline bath and left the solution for some time. The solution was then used to bathe a non-innervated second heart. If the vagus nerve on the first heart was stimulated, negative inotropic, that is beat amplitude, and chronotropic, that is beat rate activity were seen in both hearts. This did not occur in either heart if the vagus nerve was not stimulated. The vagus nerve was adding something to the saline solution. The effect could be blocked using atropine, a known inhibitor to heart vagal nerve stimulation. Clearly, something was being secreted by the vagus nerve affecting the heart. The wax stuff, as Lowe called it, causing the myotropic muscle enhancing effect, was later identified to be acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Lowe won the Nobel Prize for his discovery. Recent work in endocrinology focuses on the molecular mechanisms responsible for triggering the effect of hormones. The first example of such work being done was in 1962 by Earl Sutherland. Sutherland investigated whether hormones enter cells to evoke action or stayed outside the cells. He studied norepinephrine, which acts on the liver to convert glycogen into glucose via the activation of the phosphorylase enzyme, as is shown in the figure. He homogenized the liver into a membrane fraction and a soluble fraction. Phosphorylase is soluble, and added norepinephrine to the membrane fraction, extracted its soluble products and added them to the first soluble fraction. Phosphorylase activated, indicating that norepinephrine's target receptor was on the cell membrane, not located intracellularly. He later identified the compound as cyclic AMP or CAMP, and with his discovery created the concept of second messenger mediated pathways. He, like Lowe, won the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking work in the field of endocrinology. Dear students, we have understood the historical perspective of endocrinology and also learned about the discovery of various hormones. We will now discuss about the discovery of several endocrine glands. Dear students, let's first discuss the pituitary gland, which was earlier referred to as the master gland of the body. Although documentation of yet to be characterized pituitary disorders may date back to ancient Egypt, it was Galen who in 150 CE first described the pituitary gland. It was suggested that it drained phlegm from the brain to the nasopharynx, as is depicted in the figure. In the 18th century, various pituitary disorders were described, including amenorrhea, acromegaly, and diabetes insipidus. However, it wasn't until 1887 that Minkowski first linked expansion of the pituitary gland to several clinical syndromes. This led to acceptance that anatomical expansion was what produced these syndromes and the natural interest in operating on the pituitary. Now coming to the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid glands were the last organs visible to naked eye to be described. In 1850, Sir Richard Owen, curator of the Natural History Museum, described a small compact yellow glandular body attached to the thyroid during the dissection of an Indian rhinoceros that died in London Zoo. In 1887, Ivor Sandstrom, a 25-year-old medical student at the University of Uppsala, confirmed the existence of the newly discovered organ in 50 human cadavers. Even at this stage, he described the great variation in position, vascular supply, and appearance of the glands that represent part of the mystique of parathyroid surgery to this day. Now moving on to the adrenal gland. Bartholomeus Eustachius first depicted the adrenal glands in 1552, naming them glandulae renibus incubentus because of their location close to the kidneys. Surprisingly, the early anatomists, including Galen and even Leonardo da Vinci, had overlooked them. Successive names, including capsulae, suprarenales, and glandulae renales, the terms cortex and medulla to describe the two component parts, were first used by the anatomist and embryologist Emil Huske, working in Jena, Germany in 1845. Now, dear students, we will discuss the functional understanding of the adrenals. The function of the adrenals remains speculative, but in 1855, the Parisian physiologist Claude Bernard proposed that the adrenals produced internal secretions. Coincidentally, in the same year, Thomas Edison described 11 patients showing clinical features of adrenal insufficiency. Autopsy showed adrenal gland disease, destruction, or atrophy. Observing death in animals after bilateral adrenalectomy, Charles Edward and Brown Squared concluded that the adrenals were essential for life. But early progress in the understanding of adrenal physiology was slow. At Johns Hopkins University, William Osler made an extract of pig's adrenal, which he used in an attempt to treat adrenal insufficiency in 1896, whilst John Jacob Abel isolated epinephrine in 1897. With limited understanding of adrenal pathophysiology, unsuccessful attempts were made in 1920 to treat Addison's disease with epinephrine. However, the breakthrough came at the same institution in the late 1930s when Edward Kendall isolated and later synthesized cortisone. He and Tadeusz Richstein, working independently in Basel, Switzerland, were later awarded the Nobel Prize for their achievements. Subsequently, the biochemistry of the remaining steroid, adrenal cortical hormones, and the catecholamine hormones of the medulla unfolded and permitted an understanding of the various syndromes of adrenal endocrine dysfunction. Many of these conditions, especially those associated with excessive hormonal secretion, became amenable to surgical treatment. Now we will discuss the discoveries related to the thyroid gland. In 1600 BCE, the Chinese made use of burnt sponge and seaweed as a therapy for goiters, while in about 1500 BCE, Indian texts mention goiter as galaganda and describe its treatment. Slightly later, still Pliny commented on goiter epidemics and the therapeutic use of burnt seaweed. In 150 CE, Galen too suggested spongia usta, burnt sponge, for goiter. So it's that we encounter very early references to thyroid medicine. However, the thyroid gland was not described anatomically until 1475, when Chinese physician Wang He recommended its treatment with dried thyroid. Half a century later, the Swiss scholar Paracelsus suggested a link between goiter and mineral impurities in water. One of the earliest references to the thyroid in Western medicine dates from 1656, when it was identified by the English anatomist Thomas Wotton. Wotton gave thyroid its name from the Greek thureos, as its shape was reminiscent of the shields depicted in ancient Greece. Now, let us have a look at the mechanism by which function of thyroid gland was elucidated. Numerous suggestions were made regarding the thyroid function, such as lubrication of the trachea, diversion of blood from the brain, or a cosmetic role in females. In 1820, Rush explained the larger thyroid gland in women as being necessary to guard the female system from the influence of the more numerous causes of irritation and vexation of mind to which they are exposed than the male sex. In the same year, Hofrichter commented, husbands would have learned to recognize the swelling of this gland as a danger signal of threatening trouble from their better halves. With regard to diseases of the thyroid, cretinism was first described in 1871. In 1894, Gull recorded the clinical change seen in thyroid atrophy and adopted the term myxedema. because he thought the characteristic thickening of subcutaneous tissue was caused by excessive mucus formation and deposition under the skin. In 1891, Murray noted a good clinical response in hypothyroidism by injecting patients with sheep thyroid extracts. During the 19th century, Coindit, an Edinburgh-trained physician working in Geneva, successfully treated goiters with iodine. Thyroidectomies were successfully undertaken in 1884 for treatment of toxic goiter. In Europe, Swiss surgeon Theodor Kocher performed over 2,000 thyroidectomies with a reported mortality rate of 5%. He was rewarded in 1909 with a Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for his work on the physiology, pathology, and surgery of the thyroid gland. Meanwhile, in the USA, Charles Horace Mayo became an authority on thyroid surgery. By the 1920s, thyroid surgery was very common. Dear students, let us now understand thyroid hormones. It was in the 20th century that the thyroid secretion of an iodine-containing substance was examined. In 1914, Edward Kendall isolated crystalline thyroxine, that is T4. He found it had the same effects as the thyroid extract from which it came. More than a decade later, in London in 1926, Harrington defined the chemical formula of T4 and subsequently synthesized the hormone. The ability to synthesize sodium L-thyroxine and the fact that it could be absorbed orally made thyroid replacement safe and cheap. The calorigenic effect of synthetic T4 was less than that of thyroid extracts. However, this enigma was not resolved until 1952, when Rosalind Pitt-Rivers and her postdoctoral fellow Jack Gross discovered and synthesized triiodothyronine, that is T3, and proved it was biologically more active than T4, that is thyroxine. Dear students, now that we have understood about the history of thyroid hormones, we will now discuss hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. It was not until 1786 that the link was made between thyroid enlargement and the clinical appearance of hyperthyroidism. It was noted by Paré, a provincial physician in Bath, but he did not publish his observations until 1825. This publication was followed by the classic descriptions by Graves and von Besidow in 1835 and 1840 respectively. Robert Graves is primarily remembered for his clinical description of Graves' disease of the thyroid gland. Von Besidow also described many of the main features of hyperthyroidism, but although his work was contemporaneous with that of Graves, he did not publish until 5 years later. Despite this, the disease is referred to as Besidow's disease in many non-English speaking countries. Dear students, let us now discuss hypothyroidism. The Japanese physician Hikaru Hashimoto from Kyoto first described the symptoms of struma lymphomatosa in 1912, known as Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This autoimmune condition sees infiltration of lymphocytes into the thyroid. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture, that is History of Endocrinology. Hope you have understood it well. Thank you. Goodbye.